At 8:43 a.m., a Lockheed F-5 Lightning sliced through cloud veils off the coast of Bougainville. Beneath its silver wings, palm canopies looked unbroken, an emerald skin concealing everything. Yet inside the darkroom hours later, a young analyst named Lieutenant Robert Kingsley leaned over a wet contact sheet and froze. Under magnification, the shadows between coconut trunks ran parallel, too perfect, too straight. Not nature, runways, hidden Japanese airfields disguised so skillfully that even the tropic sun could barely betray them. Camouflage density exceeds expectation. Photogrammetry recommends secondary pattern analysis. A line typed in bureaucratic calm, masking panic. For every invisible runway discovered, two more seemed to rise out of the jungle. American bombers, striking at coordinates days late, had cratered empty beaches. Pilots began to joke that the enemy flew on ghosts. But how did Japan's engineers hide concrete beneath coconuts? And why did Allied eyes need shadow instead of sight to find them? And behind every blurred frame, what stories unfolded? The heat-struck laborers, the women tracing maps by lamplight, the black American technicians whose names never reached a headline. This is the untold theater of World War II, the war of lenses, light, and deception. A silent struggle fought not with bullets, but with film negatives and palm leaves. December 14, 1943, Espiritu Santo Air Base, 13th Air Force reconnaissance log. At dawn, a humid mist clung to the tarmac at Espiritu Santo. Mechanics moved like ghosts beneath winged silhouettes, their breath mixing with the haze of aviation fuel. A sergeant marked the flight board, F-5 Lightning, serial 43-28362, target grid Tropic 42. The pilot, Lieutenant Robert Kingsley, checked his oxygen mask once more. He had orders from the 13th Air Force Photo Recon section. Map the north coast of Bougainville for rumored Japanese runways, though none had ever been confirmed by ground scouts. The Lightning's twin engines screamed against the morning silence, scattering seabirds into the gray Pacific air. As Kingsley climbed through fractured clouds, the island below looked like a painter's canvas. Palm crowns spread in rhythmic lines, beaches untouched. He circled twice, photographing through breaks in the canopy. Nothing. Only the deep green sheen of jungle and the faint shimmer of ocean reefs. But the film, when developed, told another story. In a dark room 2 days later, Corporal Helen Price, one of the few trained photo interpreters stationed at the base, tilted the wet negatives toward the red light. Between the veins of coconut palms, she noticed unnatural symmetry, thin, ruler-straight shadows slicing diagonally across the image. At first she thought it was lens flare. Then, as she marked them with a grease pencil, she saw the faint line of tire ruts leading into the pattern. Not nature, not coincidence. A runway concealed beneath living trees. The discovery raced through channels to Pearl Harbor's Photo Intelligence Center, coded under the file name Emerald Phantom. The War Department's analysts were incredulous. How could a fully operational airfield, large enough to launch Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, hide beneath palm trees? In the following weeks, 5 more such patterns appeared across reconnaissance grids, each showing identical alignment to the prevailing sun angles. A March 1944 report by the War Department's camouflage section described it with unsettling precision. Camouflage netting integrated into organic canopy, foliage density 84%, heat signatures minimal during daylight hours. Even now historians debate the genius of that concealment. Japanese engineers had discovered that sunlight scattered differently on coconut leaves than on synthetic netting, so they simply grew the camouflage themselves, pruning palms to form an aerial illusion. Beneath them, hundreds of forced laborers from New Britain and Rabaul laid steel mesh and poured asphalt, earning less than a handful of rice per day, barely 1 to 200 calories by Red Cross estimates. When American bombers struck these sites based on outdated maps, they often cratered decoy strips made of painted bamboo. One pilot wrote in a debrief, "We bombed the jungle and the jungle never blinked." By late 1943, disbelief turned to obsession. Every cloud shadow, every riverbank reflection became suspect. Teams began testing shadow vector charts, calculating angles to detect man-made geometry. Out of this paranoia, a new intelligence field was born, photo pattern analysis. Signal Corps memo from January 1944 complained of excessive shadow literacy. a dry phrase masking the fear that the Allies might lose the Pacific not to superior weapons, but to invisible construction. What Kingsley saw that morning, what Helen Price revealed under the red light, changed the very way war was fought. Shadows became data, leaves became deception, but behind every blurred frame lay human cost. Laborers collapsed under tropical fevers, their names lost to ledgers. Japanese engineers wrote in diaries about feeding the forest with iron, and in Allied camps thousands of miles away, analysts argued over whether a single crooked palm might betray an entire squadron. So the question lingers, even now. If nature itself could be weaponized, what chance did human eyes ever have? January 9th, 1944. Pearl Harbor Photo Intelligence Center, Pacific Fleet Report No. 6. Inside a repurposed warehouse near Pearl Harbor's Hickam Field, light barely touched the rows of desks. Men and women worked under shaded lamps, their fingers blackened by developer fluid. On each table lay hundreds of reconnaissance prints from the Solomon Islands, identical shots of jungle, coastline, and clouds. Most eyes saw green, a few saw war. At 02:10 hours, Chief Analyst Captain Edward Fairbanks called for silence. He placed a magnifier over one photograph and said simply, "They're building ghosts." The photo showed the faint lattice of palms bending at identical angles, their shadows aligned to magnetic north. A hidden runway again. And this one had tire marks from a Ki-61 high-end fighter. The discovery triggered Operation Greenweb, a classified coordination between the USAF's 5th Photo Recon Squadron and the Navy's Combat Cartography Unit. Their task, detect invisible infrastructure before it struck back. The method was brutal in its simplicity. Photograph the same area every 48 hours at identical altitudes, then layer transparencies to reveal what moved. A tree line here, a new shadow there. Subtle, almost imperceptible. Yet those micro-changes revealed entire air bases blooming beneath the jungle. A Red Cross field report from Rabaul. June 1943 had already noted native laborers drafted under extreme tropical fatigue, constructing clearings under live canopy. No one in Washington read that line closely until the photos arrived. When they did, the connection was obvious. Japan was converting the tropics themselves into weapons. The technicians at Pearl became the new frontline soldiers. Most had never left American soil, but they fought with rulers and lightboxes instead of rifles. Sergeant Martha Ellison, one of the few Women's Army Corps interpreters, described her shifts in a letter home. "We read jungles like crime scenes. The leaves whisper what they're hiding." Her team worked 12-hour rotations, tracing with wax pencils until their wrists ached. Every 10th photo contained nothing. The 11th could determine where a bomber squadron would die or live. The stakes were measured not in miles, but in millimeters. Fairbanks introduced an experimental overlay grid, matching each palm shadow to sun azimuth angles. When plotted correctly, the invisible runways emerged as faint stripes. Aerial deception unraveled through geometry. Outside, the Honolulu press ran headlines about sugar production and victory gardens. No one mentioned the Emerald Phantom. Even among officers, the term became taboo. Superstition spread that saying it aloud before a mission cursed the crew. A January 1944 signal intelligence memo summarized the mood. Enemy camouflage efficiency exceeds 80%. Morale within recon units strained by failure to verify targets. Fairbanks countered with numbers, not faith. "Shadows don't lie," he said. "Only eyes do." His team eventually identified 7 operational airfields under canopy between Bougainville, New Ireland, and the Bismarck Archipelago, each confirmed by captured supply manifests listing aviation fuel drums labeled Project Sora, Japanese for sky. It was a linguistic ghost story, fitting the invisible war they were fighting. Retention hook. Imagine peeling back a living forest only to find an entire squadron crouched beneath it. Heat muted, engines silent, waiting for darkness. That realization struck not with noise, but with the quiet shock of recognition. By March, the Pacific Command had begun to reframe strategy. Bombers were ordered to strike shadow logic, not coordinates. Angles, tones, and geometric impossibilities became targets. It was the birth of a new doctrine, to see not what the camera showed, but what it concealed. And yet the question grew darker. If an empire could disappear under its own trees, how many other truths of this war might be hiding in plain sight? May 1944, Women's Army Corps record, Hickam Field Photo Lab, 46 operators on 12-hour shifts. Morning at Hickam Field, May 1944. The hangars still smelled of scorched rubber from a training mishap the night before. Inside one low, windowless building, the air buzzed not with engines, but with machines that hummed softly, enlargers, dryers, and calibration lamps. Here, amid reels of aerial film, 46 women of the Women's Army Corps stared into magnifiers until the world reduced to inches of jungle and shadow. They called themselves Shadow Watchers. No medals, no parades, just tired eyes and the faint tang of developer fluid that never left their skin. Each morning began the same. The night courier would drop fresh canisters from reconnaissance flights out of Tarawa and Truk Lagoon, their labels marked with grease pencil, green web. Sector C, the film, still cool from high-altitude cold, unspooled into water baths. Operators like Private Anna Burke, 22, would ease the negatives onto drying racks, counting frames under her breath. 112 images, each a fraction of a second that might alter the war. Captain Edward Fairbanks, newly reassigned from Pearl Harbor, paced behind them. He'd grown thinner since the Emerald Phantom discoveries, his hair prematurely gray. Yet the war of images only deepened. Now every island from the Bismarck Archipelago to the Marianas demanded mapping. Proof point 2 came from Signal Corps Calibration Memo, September 1943, still pinned above the lab door. Maintain focal accuracy plus 0.3 mm to avoid false pattern correlation. The note served as gospel. Even a hairline distortion could turn a palm grove into a phantom runway or erase a real one. Each frame was analyzed twice, once by the human eye, then by a new optical comparator that magnified details 30 times. Operators tracked tiny differences, a change in leaf angle, the sudden appearance of a straight line through the foliage. Burke once said to a visiting reporter from the Honolulu Advertiser, "We don't see islands anymore, just shadows with intentions." The paper never printed her quote, it was wartime censorship, but Fairbanks remembered it. Every few hours, the lights dimmed for the overlap sessions, when two prints were projected side by side to detect movement. In one pair, an unbroken jungle canopy from March showed a faint scar in April, a hair-thin clearing no longer than a city street. The women gasped softly. Fairbanks nodded. Another runway under palms. Another invisible airfield about to come to life. For every revelation, a mystery deepened. How could men, tools, and concrete move beneath foliage without betraying heat? Engineers later theorized that Japanese ground crews worked at night, laying steel matting cooled by rainfall, and hung wet palm fronds over exhaust vents to scatter infrared detection. The deception was alive, breathing, adapting, but the emotional toll was mounting. These women were among the first in American history to carry military intelligence responsibility equal to men. Yet outside the lab, the same officers they briefed often doubted them. One colonel joked, "You girls see palm trees in your sleep." Burke didn't laugh. She hadn't slept properly in weeks. In her pocket notebook, she scribbled a question that later surfaced in her memoir, Glass Eyes, 1951. How can we trust sight when the enemy teaches shadows to lie? That line outlived her, quoted in post-war intelligence manuals for decades. As night fell, the hum of the enlargers faded, and the operators walked out under the tropical stars. On the far side of the base, black guards from the Quartermaster Corps changed shifts, saluting the women as they passed. Both groups worked unseen, bound by a quiet war of patience. The next batch of negatives was already en route from Bougainville, flying in the cargo hold of a returning B-24. Inside, more secrets waited, runways invisible even to the pilots who flew over them. June 1944, 99th Signal Photographic Company, Field Correspondence, Guam Photo Relay Depot. The summer of 1944 pressed against the Pacific like a hand against glass, humid, relentless, impossible to ignore. In the canvas-sided huts of the 99th Signal Photographic Company on Guam, reels of aerial film arrived by the crate, each labeled in grease pencil. Truk, Palau, Rabaul. Outside, B-29s droned toward the horizon. Inside, light tables buzzed. Corporal Joseph Tillman, a soft-spoken black technician from St. Louis, ran his hand across the polished lens of a K-17 camera mount. The machine was his world, heavy, fragile, precise. The irony was never lost on him. He could build an optical heart strong enough to expose the Pacific, yet still wasn't allowed to eat in the same mess hall as the officers who read his data. The segregated barracks stood 50 yards from the lab, separated by a gravel path and unspoken rules. Still, every evening the white photo officers left their film reels outside for pickup. Tillman's crew worked through the night, splicing, cleaning, labeling. They were ghosts, as invisible as the Japanese runways they revealed. Proof Point 2, July 1944, War Department Technical Bulletin, TB Int 201. Aerial mosaic procedures, drafted partly from these men's field notes. Few ever knew their names, but their hands, their calculations, fed directly into the great Allied push across the Central Pacific. When the heat grew unbearable, Tillman stepped outside to breathe. Across the depot yard, a group of Mexican-American laborers from the Army Service Corps loaded crates of sodium thiosulfate, fixer solution, onto trucks bound for Saipan. They joked in Spanish, singing swing tunes broadcast from Armed Forces Radio Honolulu. For a moment, the war's divisions softened under the same radio crackle. Tillman looked toward the sea. The same light that blinded him by day also revealed enemy airfields at night. That paradox, light as both weapon and witness, defined his war. Inside, his partner, Private Elsie Tanaka, a Nisei linguist fluent in Japanese, translated captured field memos that accompanied the photos. One line stayed with her: "Build the sky within the trees." It came from a Japanese engineer's instruction sheet found near Rabaul. To her it read like poetry. To the Americans it was evidence. The team mapped every deceptive shadow, tree lines that masked hangars, streams rerouted to disguise fuel dumps. Their overlays turned chaos into order, invisible into known. Yet beyond the lab's walls, the Pacific Front devoured certainty. Bombers returning from missions over Truk Lagoon reported empty craters and false targets. The jungle was still winning. One humid evening, Tillman's commander brought in an officer from the press section, a young white reporter from the Honolulu Star-Bulletin. He asked to see how the colored boys do it. Tillman said nothing, just guided him to the projection table. Under the magnifier, he pointed at a print, an unbroken canopy of palms, one faint scar running through it. "Runway," he said. The reporter blinked. "Where?" Tillman smiled. "Exactly." Later, in his dispatch, the reporter wrote a single line that sensors let through. "They see what we cannot." Those 6 words, buried on page 6, captured the truth no policy could admit. That victory in the shadow war depended on the vision of people the nation still refused to see. By August, the Pacific Fleet photo relay logged over 1.2 million negatives processed, the largest visual intelligence archive in American history. Each print was a silent conversation between light and conscience, a record of how perception itself became a battlefield. When the last shift ended, Tillman wiped his lenses clean and locked the crate. Outside, the island smelled of salt and diesel. The sky, lit by distant bombardment, shimmered like a negative still waiting to be developed. He whispered to no one, "Someday they'll see us too." February 1944, Japanese Army Engineer Unit 108, Halmahera Island Field Diary, translated by Australian intelligence. Rainfall hammered the tin roofs of Halmahera Island, turning the construction yard into a swamp of red clay and sweat. Beneath the monsoon, the men of Engineer Unit 108 moved in silence, bent beneath bamboo poles dragging lengths of palm netting toward an unfinished runway. Sergeant Takeshi Mori, 30 years old, wiped rain from his eyes and glanced upward. To any aircraft above 10,000 feet, the jungle looked untouched. That was the point. His unit had orders from the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force Command at Rabaul: conceal the entire airfield from aerial sight within 60 days. They worked through nights thick with insects, guided by acetylene lanterns covered in green cloth to muffle the glow. The design was known as Kage no Mori, Forest of Shadows. Proof Point 2, Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit Report, July 1944. noted the capture of a 1/5000 scale blueprint labeled Project Sora, listing palm-to-palm spacing at 2.4 meters. The measurements were not random. Each palm trunk cast a precise shadow, calibrated to blend with natural sun angles. By aligning tree placement with celestial geometry, the engineers ensured that Allied aerial photos registered only an unbroken canopy. Maury recorded in his diary on February 18th, "We are not building airfields, we are teaching trees to lie." That single line, later found by Australian troops, became a haunting symbol of Japan's invisible war. Local laborers, Papuan men and conscripted villagers, carried gravel baskets for 14 hours each day. Their pay was measured not in yen but in ladles of rice. Japanese supply reports show rations dropped to 1.2 go, about 180 grams, per worker by spring. Still, they labored, some believing the jungle itself would protect them. In the brief clearings between storms, the engineers paused to test camouflage density. Aerial observers climbed scaffolds and photographed the canopy from 40 feet up, evaluating how light scattered across the new growth. When the prints developed, they celebrated faintness, proof of invisibility. At dusk, Maury led his squad in prayer before a bamboo shrine facing east. He did not pray for victory, but for patience. They were fighting physics now, the angle of the sun, the color of leaves, the mathematics of survival. Meanwhile, word spread across the islands of American shadow analysts, the invisible enemy decoding their work from the sky. Some engineers mocked them, others feared them. Lieutenant Nakamura, a cartographer from Osaka, whispered one night, "They are gods who read light." But faith was a thin defense. Supplies dwindled. Fever took the young. The men drank rainwater mixed with engine oil to kill parasites. Still, the construction continued. A captured Japanese manual, translated by Allied linguists in August 1944, described camouflage principles with eerie poetry. "The leaf is our uniform. The forest is our barracks. The sky must never know our name." Retention hook. Imagine standing beneath that living ceiling, hearing the distant rumble of B-25 engines, knowing the bombers will pass directly overhead, blind. The air vibrates with tension, a paradox of safety and suffocation. Each successful deception brought both triumph and despair. They built what they could never reveal, hid what they could never show. Maury wrote again in his notebook, "To vanish is to win. To be seen is to die." By March, Project Sora was operational. From above, Halmahera was only jungle. Beneath, a squadron of Ki-48 bombers idled, their propellers turning in rhythm with the rain, and far away in dark rooms half a world apart, American analysts stared at photographs of that same jungle, puzzled by shadows that looked too perfect. United States Army Air Force's Reconnaissance Summary, Pacific Theater, March 1944. Unusual canopy consistency, Halmahera sector. Possible artificial patterning suspected. The discovery began not with bombs, but with boredom. On the 14th of March, 1944, Lieutenant Frank Whitaker, a 24-year-old aerial photo interpreter, stationed at Port Moresby, sat hunched over a stereoscope, 2 small mirrors and a stack of overlapping negatives. He had been assigned what he called leaf duty, combing hundreds of square miles of Pacific jungle, searching for things that didn't quite look like trees. Most interpreters lasted 2 hours before fatigue blurred the world into green haze. Whitaker lasted 12. Then, just before dusk, he found it. 2 photographs taken 3 days apart, same altitude, same coordinates, showed identical shadows. Not similar, identical. A perfect repetition of palm silhouettes, down to the angle of the fronds. That never happened in nature. He circled the coordinates and scrawled in pencil, "Canopy duplication and possible Japi. Installation." That annotation would later trigger one of the most significant shifts in the Pacific Aerial Way, where Operation Decoy Sky, a code named Study to Decode Japan's Camouflage Empire. Half a world away, deep in the soaked jungles of Halmahera, Sergeant Takeshi Mori watched his men repaint engine covers with a slurry made from crushed bark and ash. They called it shadow paste. The mixture darkened metal to mimic damp foliage under rain. The deception had worked for months. American planes flew overhead daily, never striking. But lately something had changed. The flyovers grew slower. Cameras, not bombs, filled the sky. Maury felt it in his gut before anyone confirmed it. The Americans were looking differently now. That evening, Lieutenant Nakamura returned from a staff meeting, his khaki uniform clinging with sweat and panic. "They are learning the rhythm," he whispered. "They don't see the jungle, they measure it." He tossed a packet of orders onto the ground, new camouflage protocols. Trees were to be replanted at irregular intervals. Every third palm must be removed or burned to break the symmetry. The forest itself was now under suspicion. The irony was cruel. Nature, once their ally, had become their betrayer. Halmahera Field Report, May 1944, notes the first instance of camouflage recalibration, indicating systematic destruction of previously planted canopy layers. It was a silent retreat. Men who had once built to hide were now tearing down what they'd built, trying to restore imperfection. They hacked down palms planted too precisely, left patches of bare red soil to suggest natural decay, but the corrections came too late. In a dark room at Port Moresby, Lieutenant Whitaker projected the latest film strips side by side and marked discrepancies with red wax pencil. He noticed something else: thin grey lines cutting across the jungle's texture. They were runway tracks, faint but undeniable. By late June, bombers returned, not blind this time. The first strike came at dawn, wrapped in thunderclouds. American B-25s roared over the jungle and dropped delayed fuse bombs. The canopy erupted, sheets of flame crawling across engineered treetops. For the first time, Maury's men could see the sky they'd hidden from for months. It was pale and endless, and it terrified them. The camouflage empire collapsed in hours. When the fires died, survivors found the palm lattice still smoldering, a man-made forest turned skeleton. Among the wreckage, Maury found his notebook half burned. Only 2 lines were legible. "We built the sky a mask, and the mask learned to burn." Back in Port Moresby, Lieutenant Whitaker pinned an enlarged photo of the ruined site to the briefing board. The caption beneath read, "Camouflage defeated by its own perfection." He didn't know the men's names or what they'd built, but he understood the message. Every lie, no matter how elaborate, casts its own shadow. And somewhere, someone is always watching the light. Allied Intelligence Bureau Memorandum, Brisbane, 18th July 1944. Initiation of Cross-Disciplinary Analysis Unit for Aerial Photo Interpretation, integrating mathematical and biological expertise. The war for the Pacific was no longer measured in miles of ocean or tons of bombs. It was measured in pixels of shadow. In the basement of the Allied Intelligence Bureau in Brisbane, the air hummed with electricity and human tension. Long tables were covered with overlapping negatives, transparent rulers, and magnifying lamps that buzzed like trapped insects. The smell of photo developer clung to the walls. Each reel of film arriving from Port Moresby represented a battlefield thousands of kilometers wide, and every misread shadow could mean hundreds of lost lives. It was here that Dr. Evelyn Porter, a young botanist from the University of Sydney, found herself translating the language of palm leaves into the vocabulary of war. Porter had spent her pre-war years studying light absorption in tropical plants. Now she was charting it on reconnaissance photographs, tracing how chlorophyll reflectivity betrayed artificial camouflage. She called her approach spectral intuition, phrase her military superiors disliked but secretly depended upon. Trees lie differently than men build, she told one skeptical colonel in August 1944. He stared at her for a long moment before approving. The Research Budget. U.S. War Department Collaboration Order. Photographic Interpretation Section, Joint Pacific Analysis Project, August 12, 1944. The memo authorized cooperation between American and Australian experts, merging fields that had never before shared a table: mathematicians, physicists, artists, and even birdwatchers, whose training in recognizing natural patterns under shifting light proved unexpectedly vital. At one end of the room, a cartographer named Samuel Reeves used a compass and an artist's brush to shadow paint the likely positions of Japanese fuel depots, adjusting the angle of light with a small mirror to test camouflage plausibility. His mock runways, drawn from observation, often matched later strikes within meters. At the other, Porter worked beside a mathematician named Lieutenant Harold Klein, who had once calculated railway timetables for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Together, they discovered that shadows cast by artificial canopies had a repeatable rhythm, a pattern repeating every 32 feet on average, corresponding to human planting intervals. That rhythm would soon become the algorithm for decoding deception from 10,000 feet above. Every few weeks, crates of new film arrived by C-47 transport from Nadzab airfield, labeled with mission codes and timestamps. The interpreters called them eyes from the sky. They handled each reel like evidence from a crime scene. At 3 a.m. on the 22nd of August, Reeves noticed something strange on one of those reels. Tiny, bright flecks, regularly spaced, at the edge of what appeared to be a swamp on Biak Island. Porter leaned in and whispered, "They're reflections, metallic but faint." Klein ran the measurements and cross-referenced the pattern. It wasn't swamp water. It was the corrugated roofing of a hidden aircraft maintenance bay. 3 days later, B-25 bombers from the 38th Bomb Group hit the site. Reconnaissance after the raid confirmed a direct strike. For the first time, the Brisbane lab's invisible war had left visible scars on the enemy's map. In the following weeks, success bred obsession. The analysts developed a ritual. Before each new batch of film, someone read aloud a clipped report from the front. Calories rationed to 2,800 per day at forward bases, flight hours extended to 14, camera film down to 36 rolls per mission. The room would fall silent, aware that every fraction of an inch they studied could mean a man surviving another dawn patrol. As one interpreter later recalled in an oral history interview, "We were killing and saving people through geometry. What if a shadow could lie? Could the enemy learn to bend sunlight itself? Fake depth, fake motion, fake time?" In September 1944, those questions weren't hypothetical. Reports began to arrive from the Central Pacific Command that Japanese engineers were experimenting with movable canopies, camouflage that shifted with the sun. For the Allies, it meant only one thing. Their invisible war was entering a new phase. The jungle wasn't standing still anymore. The Pacific War had entered a strange new realm, one fought not by bullets or bayonets, but by graphs and grey scales. In a low-lit laboratory beneath Hickam Field, Honolulu, reels of reconnaissance film whispered through projectors, like ghosts returning from the front. Each frame contained thousands of details: palm leaves, corrugated roofs, gun barrels half hidden under straw. But the human eye could only see so much. The rest, those invisible signatures of deception, had to be taught to reveal themselves. That was the mission of Project Lumina, a small experimental unit tasked with quantifying the way sunlight betrayed human construction. Among them was Corporal Elsie Donnelly, one of the first women transferred from the Women's Army Corps to serve in a scientific analysis role. Her days began before dawn, calibrating photometers and measuring the angle of the Hawaiian sun. To the bomber crews overhead, she was invisible. But her calculations decided which coordinates they lived or died by. "The shadows tell the truth," she wrote in her log on October 5, 1944, "but only if you listen like a liar." At the center of the project was a simple revelation. Light had rhythm. Every natural canopy cast shadows that changed with wind and time. Artificial structures, no matter how cleverly built, failed to keep that rhythm. Proof point 2. Lumina Field Memo 8, 14th October 1944. Observed variance between natural canopy flicker, DTM 3.1 sec, and artificial camo net, DT 0.0 sec. What had once been instinct for interpreters like Whitaker was now mathematics. They were, in effect, teaching machines to read deceit. To test their theories, analysts overlaid sequential negatives on light tables and used hand-calibrated oscillographs, machines originally meant for radio work, to measure tonal variance. The data was crude, hand-plotted on paper. But from these jagged lines a pattern emerged, the first quantified fingerprint of camouflage. It was a strange sight. War reduced to waves and shadows, death mapped in decimals. But the results were undeniable. In late October, the Honolulu team correctly identified 6 false airstrips near Tawi-Tawi, saving an estimated 180 tons of ordnance from being wasted on empty jungle. The irony was not lost on anyone. While the skies filled with roaring B-29s and the headlines shouted of victory and vengeance, the quiet heroes of Project Lumina worked in silence, dissecting light. They had no medals, no battle ribbons, only logbooks filled with decimals and fatigue. One night, during a blackout drill, Elsie Donnelly looked across the darkened lab and whispered to her commanding officer, "Sir, if we win this war by reading shadows, what will we do when peace comes? Who will need us then?" He didn't answer. The projectors kept spinning. The war kept turning. Across the ocean in Brisbane, Dr. Evelyn Porter received the Honolulu results via encrypted cable. She spread the thin telegram across her table and smiled faintly. They had done it. They had taught war to see. The next step was something no one had tried before, merging the Pacific data sets into a single composite grid, a primitive algorithm that could predict camouflage before the camera even captured it. It was a breathtaking concept, preemptive interpretation, the precursor to what modern analysts would call predictive imaging. They fed the data from Halmahera, Biak, and Tawi into a hand-cranked calculator, aligning degrees of latitude and sun angle. Within hours, an outline appeared, ghostly but distinct, showing the shape of a potential enemy stronghold weeks before any aerial patrol had photographed it. It was the war's first algorithm. And it had been written in shadow, but even light can be deceived. Reports from Japanese radio intercepts in November 1944 suggested their engineers were adapting, using reflective sands, movable palm mats, even captured Allied parachutes to scatter light differently. The race to master the language of shadows had turned into something darker, a dialogue between two invisible empires, each learning the other's grammar of deceit. And at its heart stood people like Donnelly and Porter, unarmed, unseen yet more dangerous than any bomber. The jungle burned without witnesses. By the dawn of 1945, the Pacific War's secret war, the war of photographs, film and unseen interpreters had all but ended. What had begun with questions of shadow and sunlight now concluded with silence and ash. The great camouflaged airfields of Halmahera, Biak, and Tawi lay stripped bare, runways exposed like bones under floodlight. When the first Allied surveyors landed to document the wreckage, they found something uncanny. The palm lattices that had once fooled reconnaissance now lay fused into the ground, their trunks half charred, their leaves imprinted in soot, negative photographs of a vanished deception. Standing among them, Dr. Evelyn Porter felt no triumph. She held a melted lens from a Japanese observation post, its glass warped into a spiral of smoke. "It's as if light itself remembered what we did," she murmured to an engineer beside her. The man said nothing. He just marked coordinates and noted that 80% of camouflage materials recovered were organic, a detail destined for a report no one would read. Across the Pacific, Corporal Elsie Donnelly was reassigned to the War Department's Signal Analysis Division in Washington. D.C., her final project in Honolulu, had been archived under declassified, not yet applicable. But she couldn't forget the feeling, the hum of the projector, the grey rhythm of canopy flicker, the moment a forest revealed its lie. In her first week back on the mainland, she walked past the Lincoln Memorial at dusk. The reflecting pool shimmered under the low sun, and she caught herself measuring its brightness instinctively, noting the angle, the variance, the light. War had trained her to see deceit everywhere, even in peace. That same month, the Office of Strategic Services, soon to become the CIA, requested technical summaries from Project Lumina and its sister programs. Buried in those files were the equations for shadow frequency analysis, photometric indexing, and pattern entropy, the foundations of what modern analysts would later call remote sensing. Meanwhile, in Brisbane, Porter and Lieutenant Harold Klein oversaw the dismantling of their once secret lab. Desks were emptied, light tables sold to universities, and reels of film packed into sealed containers marked "Archival, do not expose to sunlight." One night, before shipping out, Klein took a final stroll through the lab. The projection bulbs had been removed, but he could still see the faint outlines of their work, the stains of developer fluid, the ghostly negatives left pinned to corkboards. In the quiet, he thought of the irony that their greatest victories had no parades, no headlines, just clearer photographs. He turned to Porter and asked, "Do you ever wonder if we made the world safer, or just better at seeing itself destroy?" Porter hesitated. "Maybe both," she said. "Maybe that's what vision costs." By March 1945, The war's machinery of light had already begun to transform. Engineers who once charted jungle shadows were now mapping European industrial ruins for the Marshall Plan's early planning teams, using surplus aerial cameras to estimate reconstruction needs, bridge spans, tonnage capacities, power grid losses. The same science that had once exposed deception now illuminated recovery. A Red Cross inspector visiting Brisbane in April 1945 noted, "These analysts, who once measured death from the air, now count the roofs that might shelter life again." But what happens when you can see too much? When the eye built for war no longer knows where to look in peace? As peace approached, the scientists of light and shadow found themselves at a crossroads, some drawn to reconstruction, others to secrecy. And in the ruins of Halmahera, a few Japanese engineers returned to what remained of their decoy airfields, sketching new blueprints under the same palm trees they once used to hide. The age of deception was ending. The age of observation was about to begin. Allied Occupation Education Report, Tokyo, 17th December 1946. Re-education programs enrolled 1.3 million civilians. Vocational retraining in photography, cartography, and optics among top 5 disciplines. The war ended, but the light did not fade. When the surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, the Pacific seemed for a moment to breathe again. The sea was calm, the sky mercifully empty. Yet for those who had fought their war through glass and light, people like Dr. Evelyn Porter, Lieutenant Harold Klein, and Corporal Elsie Donnelly, the peace felt strangely bright, as though the sun itself had become too sharp to look at. In Tokyo, occupation authorities quickly discovered that entire Japanese engineering divisions had specialized not in flight or weaponry, but in illusion. Their notebooks, meticulous to the last decimal, detailed methods for weaving palm fronds over aluminum fuselages, constructing decoy shadows, and painting light itself. To the Allied interpreters who read them, the irony was unbearable. The enemy's greatest artistry had been to disappear. Among the captured documents catalogued at Yokohama Technical Depot, a single folder was labeled Guang no Janjang, the War of Light. Inside were sketches of runways drawn to match sunrise angles, and the faint pencil signature of Sergeant Takeshi Mori, the same man whose diary had once whispered, "We built the sky a mask." Dr. Porter traced the signature with her finger and whispered to no one, "And we taught the mask to speak." Across the ocean in Washington, D.C., Corporal Donnelly had been promoted, now Technical Officer, Office of Strategic Services, overseeing a small program that integrated wartime photometric equations into peacetime aerial mapping. Her first assignment was neither military nor secret, a civilian contract to survey floodplains in the Midwest using wartime reconnaissance film. The same shadows that once marked targets now traced rivers, farmland, and new highways. One afternoon, while reviewing prints of the Missouri River basin, she stopped and stared. The bends of the water mirrored the same rhythmic geometry she'd once measured in Halmahera, light, moving in perfect intervals. For the first time in years, she smiled. "Maybe," she said softly, "the world still wants to be seen." 47. War Department Civilian Transition Memo, Photographic Analysis Division to provide imaging for U.S. Census and Department of Agriculture. 340 veteran analysts reassigned. But for others, the transition wasn't as gentle. Harold Klein joined a new intelligence outfit, one that would later become part of the Central Intelligence Agency. His wartime gift for pattern recognition was now used to chart airfields far beyond the Pacific. In private letters, he confessed feeling haunted by what he called after-images, phantom runways, false forests, the spectral residue of things that were never there. In 1948, while stationed in Berlin, he wrote to Porter, "Sometimes I wonder if we didn't just change enemies. The jungle was honest in its lies. The city pretends to be transparent." Her reply was brief, typed on laboratory paper from Sydney University, where she had returned to teach optical physics. "We learn to see the invisible. Now the question is, should we keep looking?" By 1950, the techniques born from the language of shadows had found new homes. Aerial reconnaissance evolved into satellite imaging, camouflage studies into environmental mapping, deception research into psychological operations. Even the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt a shattered Europe, depended on aerial surveys derived from wartime light analysis. Thousands of images, once meant for destruction, now repurposed for reconstruction. Proof. Point 3. European Recovery Program Logistics Bulletin. 1949, 9,800 aerial images utilized in estimating resource zones for Marshall Plan reconstruction. And yet, in every photograph of farms, bridges, and cities reborn, there lingered a faint echo of those early shadows from the Pacific. A reminder that every clear image had been earned through deception. In 1952, the historian John Hersey interviewed several former analysts for an article on wartime intelligence. When he asked Donnelly what she remembered most, she said, "Not the pictures, the silence between them." He pressed her to explain. She smiled sadly. That's where the war really was. So what remains of that hidden war, the one fought through cameras, mirrors, and maps? Its legacy lives quietly in the world we now inhabit. Every weather satellite, every surveillance lens, every smartphone map owes its ancestry to that strange fraternity of wartime interpreters who once measured deceit by inches of light. They did not seek glory. They sought understanding. And in the end they proved a paradox, that in war, truth may hide in darkness, but victory belongs to those who learn to see. As dawn rose over the Pacific once more, the jungles of Halmahera grew back, new palms swaying where old ones had burned. Their shadows danced again across the ground, random and free. For the first time in years, those shadows meant nothing. And in that meaninglessness, after so much deception, calculation, and destruction, there was peace.